and a white supremacist. That's their view. So they're liberal creationists.
Yeah,
But if
well,
you
they
call them that,
allow
they get
for
pissed.
stereotyping. They allow for genetics if it's a positive trait.
Yes.
So they can, Larry David's on the cover of New York Magazine, and on his head it says the Jewish brain, and they talk about Jewish IQ. But they could never say anything negative, like the Irish can't hold their whiskey. That's the only place I'm going with that. But here's what I wanted to mention about this whole idea of innate differences and inequality being just a fact of life. The beauty of a libertarian mindset is we don't care. If you have 100 as an average in math, you're going to Harvard, buddy. And Harvard doesn't have to represent everything. So the far left goes, how can you say that? How can you say that everything shouldn't be a perfect pizza pie representation of everything else? And you say, I'm not saying it. The thing about my ethos is I'm not enforcing it. I'm just letting everyone go free. You're saying blacks have to be perfectly represented at Harvard and fat white dudes have to be in the NBA, though they never say that. They absolve themselves of the pizza pie then.
No, but then they're the owners, right? The fat white dudes.
Right, yeah. I shouldn't be saying pizza pie chart, whatever.
Well, if you think about it, if we're a knowledge-based economy and most of us are getting our incomes from IQ, right, which is what education really is. I mean, you can't really take somebody who's a moron and socialize them the
All
right
you can
way.
do with education is keep smart people stimulated.
Yeah, and what we do with our Common Core and what we do with a lot of our public school is we make it so we teach the lower 25%, and our geniuses are basically bored out of their minds.
Yeah.
So they go and they do deviant things. There was a study done about high school kids that the higher IQ ones are the ones doing drugs.
Interesting.
And
Maybe they're trying to dumb themselves down.
Well, it makes sense. They're frustrated with where they are in their lives. And the income tax, which you pay after year, same thing with capital gains tax, is really just a tax on IQ. So they recognize it up to a certain point. I mean, nobody is a moron or a mental retard, below an 85 IQ is paying taxes. It's always the really smart Jewish bankers or the waspy lawyer or whatever, and who they all aspire to be. They all aspire their kids to go and do those things. And so therefore, when you do the income tax thing, it's really just a redistribution of IQ to lower IQ.
Well, it's also the bigotry of soft expectations, because you're saying you dummies obviously can't function in the world. Here's some welfare, and you just sit there and we'll do everything over here because you're retarded. But in the old day, before this obsession with education and everyone needs to go to college, it was, you're not that smart, and that wasn't an insult. You go do a trade, and those people lived full, happy lives, and they weren't on welfare. And
the really dumb people, what used to happen is they had these things called the poor laws. So you would go, if you were a rich guy in the neighborhood, you go and adopt your homeless dude, and you'd make sure he wouldn't starve to death. And that was the deal. Like, that was if you're a wealthy dude. And you see that in Latin America. You see that in like a lot of third world countries, the kind of patron where you've got, or the serfs that are living on the land who are morons, and they're taken care of by the jefe, by the commander, by the strongman. And this is a natural part of human society. We do it now in charity. We don't call it this, but that's really what it is. And,
we had it more when
welfare.
Tribalism was encouraged and not discouraged, when you had the church. I mean, a priest now, he just really works on a Sunday. But he used to work 7 days a week, solving problems with marriages and dealing with this crisis and this family crisis.
Yeah, and we used to be, when we were less kind of a multiracial republic or whatever we are now, postmodern thing, when we were more of a monoculture, we used to take care of our dummies. I mean, every family has at least one or two morons. And
look at abortion. We've eradicated Down syndrome.
Well, to a certain extent. It was interesting to me, when I was a paperboy, I had 250 houses when I was a paperboy. Actually, no, 223, actually. I had 250, then I got lazy and sold the other part off. And I had this guy, Jimmy, who had Down syndrome in my neighborhood, and I paid him, to help me do the paper route. He was a total kind of moron. He wasn't very smart. I mean, he was just not good at stuff normally, but he could move the wagon. And so I would go and have him move the wagon while I went and moved it and threw the newspapers. And nowadays we exterminate those people. I think the Down syndrome abortion rate is like 90%. Jeez. Now I got to say though that I posted an article a while ago that was really controversial from Wired about how they're using, in China, they're doing genetic testing, basically in vitro studies on how to boost IQ. So the idea was, you and your wife would get together, put the eggs in the petri dish, you'd be able to select among the eggs, the fertilized eggs, which of the ones had the higher IQ, and then you would implant it back into.
Wow.
And this is like super controversial, but I'm kind of with James Watson on this. He said everyone thinks that the future where we control our own genetics is terrible and awful, and he's like, why would it be so awful? We'd have all these smart people and hot women. Like, what would be so bad about that?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I don't really pass judgment, and the beauty of anarchy in a free society is you don't say that this version has to be enforced. So we all practice genetics. I mean, even when women go to the sperm bank, they're not they don't want a homeless man. They hate genetics until it's time to go through the sperm, and then they're like, yeah, I want to be a Harvard professor. I want to be strong. I want to see his shoulders.
Right. William Shockley, the guy who was the father of Silicon Valley, he proudly bragged about donating his sperm to a sperm bank, and there was like a Nobel Prize. There's a sperm bank for Nobel Prize winners, and he was a big proponent of it. He thought it was fantastic, and he of course invented some of the technology, the transistor that ultimately led to Silicon Valley kind of booming. And he had a lot of kind of controversial ideas too, where he would go and have a voluntary eugenics society where you would go and you would pay women who are morons to you'd pay them like $10,000 not to have kids, and you would what's the word for it? Sterilize them.
So that's the other end of the spectrum. That's just as bad as the liberals enforcing equality. Is this guy financially enforcing
but it's interesting.
inequality?
I don't think he actually did it, but I do remember there was I remember reading an article or a book somewhere along the way where a lot of the women who had like 4 or 5 kids, they couldn't figure out like why they kept getting pregnant. And so some of them were actually kind of grateful for some of this stuff, because if you can imagine, I mean, it's terrible to say this, but it's very like non-PC, but we do practice a form of eugenics all the time. When we choose who our children should date,
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely right. And what's interesting, by the way, is that in a lot of Europe, gingers, because women don't want to have ginger babies, they're not included in sperm banks, even though gingerism is linked with higher IQ. So people are making trade-offs that they're kind of having to accept.
Someone told me recently that there's no such thing as a black sperm bank.
I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I mean, it's a fucking contentious subject, and we did it too with Puerto Ricans in the 50s. We would all but encourage them to take this permanent infertility drug that would make them barren, and it wasn't shoved down their throats, but it was it was coercion, right? And Puerto Ricans found out about this, obviously, and they now have this resentment for America and New York. So just as bad as the far left meddling, this was a form of like eugenic meddling, and it was far right meddling, and that created animosity. Just like Wounded Knee all over again. Every time you fucking meddle, and every time you try to alter the future, and every time you restrict people's liberty, you make things worse off.
I think it's all about a question of voluntary and consensual. So if you're, I mean, to a certain extent, what we do right now is we have a welfare state that rewards people for having children. And you have all these people in the ghetto who have really terrible lives, and they will get pregnant because they have a baby, and the baby loves them and looks up to them.
See it in Glasgow, Scotland, all the time.
Yeah, people like having something in their life that likes them. And women like having babies. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's actually like what makes the whole world go round. And what ends up happening, though, is the state comes in and it's like, all right, here's some cash for you for your baby. So there are examples after examples after examples of women in a welfare state who are on the lower end of the IQ spectrum, who are encouraged by their family or by others to go have another kid so they can get more money from the state. And this happens. This is a eugenics policy, right? It's like the Idiocracy movie, but like it's actually happening. And what you end up having is you have the higher end IQ women who are going and marrying people, but they're having like 1, 2, 3 kids. And it makes sense because the welfare state eats its seed corn. Like if you have, think about this, right? So a lot of really smart millennials right now basically can't afford having children, can't afford housing in a lot of places. When their parents were growing up, they got to go hang out and do drugs and go to the Grateful Dead concerts.
Yeah, but they had the same amount of money.
No, it was a difference.
Baby boomers were broke.
No, but they not exactly. I mean, they didn't have all the generational like if you're a hardworking millennial now, there are all these states that have higher income taxes. Connecticut didn't even have an